You wake up one morning in the year 2150, sunlight streaming through your window, just like it has for the past 123 years. You stretch, feeling the same energy you felt at 25, the same clarity of mind, the same strength in your muscles. You walk to the mirror and see the face you've always seen, unchanged, untouched by time. No gray hair, no wrinkles, no aching joints or fading vision. Your body stopped aging decades ago, frozen at your biological prime, and every medical scan confirms what seems impossible to believe. You're not dying anymore. None of us are. Death from old age has become a historical curiosity, something your great-great-great-grandchildren learn about in school the way we learn about polio or smallpox. Humanity has conquered aging itself, and in this single achievement, we've transformed everything about what it means to be alive. This is where our journey begins, in a world where the clock has stopped ticking, where mortality is no longer the shadow hanging over every human moment, where we finally have all the time in the world. What if humans could live forever? What happens when we remove the one universal constraint that has defined every human life since the beginning of our species? The biology of aging has puzzled scientists for centuries, but over the past few decades, we've begun to understand the mechanisms that make our bodies deteriorate over time. At the ends of our chromosomes sit protective caps called telomeres, composed of repeated DNA sequences that act as a biological clock, counting the number of times each cell has divided. Every time a cell replicates, these telomeres get a little shorter, like a candle burning down millimeter by millimeter. Eventually, after about 40 to 60 divisions, cells reach what's called the Hayflick limit, where they can't divide anymore and begin to age. This isn't just an abstract laboratory phenomenon. This is happening in your body right now, in your skin cells and your blood cells, and the lining of your intestines. Billions of tiny clocks, all counting down simultaneously toward an inevitable endpoint. When telomeres reach a critical length, cells perceive them as exposed DNA ends, triggering a DNA damage response that forces cells to stop dividing. These cells don't just quietly retire. They become what scientists call senescent cells, zombie cells that stop functioning properly but refuse to die, instead pumping out inflammatory chemicals that damage surrounding tissue and accelerate the aging process in a vicious cycle. But here's the fascinating part. Our bodies produce an enzyme called telomerase that can actually repair telomeres and restore their length. This enzyme exists in high quantities in developing embryos and in stem cells, which is why children heal so quickly and why a fetus can grow from a single cell into a complete human being. The problem is that as humans develop and cells replicate more frequently, telomerase gets used up and is later replenished only in minute quantities. Most of our adult cells have almost no telomerase activity, which means they're locked into this inevitable countdown toward senescence and death. Evolution didn't make this choice randomly. Too much telomerase activity can lead to cancer by helping cells become functionally immortal and avoid the Hayflick limit. Cancer cells are essentially cells that have figured out how to reactivate their telomerase, allowing them to divide endlessly without aging. So in a very real sense, aging is the price we pay for not getting cancer, a biological trade-off that evolution settled on millions of years ago as the least bad option for keeping multicellular organisms alive long enough to reproduce. Imagine a world where we've solved this puzzle, where scientists have figured out how to maintain telomerase activity at optimal levels throughout life, high enough to prevent aging, but carefully regulated to prevent runaway cellular growth. Or perhaps we've gone even further, developing therapies that don't just slow aging, but actually reverse it, selectively eliminating senescent cells that accumulate with age and cause inflammation and tissue dysfunction. In our current timeline, drugs designed to target senescent cells are already undergoing human clinical trials for age-related diseases, so this future isn't as distant as it might seem. But let's imagine we've perfected these therapies, made them universally available, and achieved what every human civilization has dreamed about since the beginning of recorded history: biological immortality. You can still die from accidents, from violence, from sudden illness, but your body no longer betrays you with age. You don't deteriorate. You don't weaken. You simply exist, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, for as long as you choose to continue. The immediate psychological impact would be almost incomprehensible. Every major decision you've ever made has been shadowed by the knowledge that your time is limited. You choose careers based partly on how many productive years you have left. You have children because you want to leave something of yourself behind. You take risks or avoid them based on calculations about whether you'll live to see the consequences. Remove the deadline, and all of these calculations change fundamentally. Why rush into marriage when you have centuries to find the right person? Why have children now when you could wait 100 years? Why take any unnecessary risks when you have infinite time to enjoy the rewards of safety? The concept of a life stage would become almost meaningless. Currently, human life divides naturally into childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, middle age, and old age, each stage defined partly by biological changes, but also by social expectations tied to how much time we have left. But in a world without aging, you might spend 50 years as a musician, then retrain as a doctor, then spend another century as an architect, constantly reinventing yourself because there's no pressure to choose one path and stick with it until retirement or death. The social structures built around limited lifespans would crumble within a generation. Marriage as a lifelong commitment made sense when lifelong meant maybe 50 years together if you were lucky. But would marriages survive 500 years? Would the concept of marriage even make sense anymore? Or would we develop new relationship structures designed for the reality of unlimited time? The phrase, "till death do us part," loses all meaning when death stops being a near certainty. Friendships would transform in equally profound ways. You could maintain relationships with people for centuries, watching them explore different versions of themselves, seeing them succeed and fail, and reinvent themselves over and over. Or you might drift apart for 100 years and then reconnect as if no time had passed. Because when you have unlimited time, what's a century between friends? The economic implications would make every other economic revolution in human history look trivial by comparison. Retirement becomes absurd as a concept when nobody ages. Why stop working? You're not getting tired, not losing mental sharpness, not experiencing the physical decline that makes retirement necessary in our current world. But this creates a catastrophic problem. If nobody retires and nobody dies, where do new jobs come from? Imagine being a talented young person entering the workforce and discovering that every position of power, every senior role, every seat of authority is occupied by someone who's been doing that job for 200 years and shows no signs of leaving. The gerontocracy would be absolute and permanent. Wealth would concentrate in the hands of the unkillable old, who have had centuries to accumulate resources and establish power structures. Young people would face a choice between waiting centuries for their turn or rebelling against a system where age brings permanent advantage. The generational conflict that exists in every human society would intensify to the point of societal fracture. Population growth would become an existential crisis within decades. Currently, human population stays relatively stable because birth rates roughly balance death rates once societies develop beyond a certain point, but remove death from aging, which accounts for the vast majority of deaths in developed countries, and suddenly you have births with almost no deaths to balance them. The global population would explode exponentially, doubling every few decades, overwhelming Earth's resources in a terrifyingly short time. We would face impossible choices almost immediately. Do we implement mandatory birth control, forcing people to obtain licenses to have children? Do we establish lotteries where only a small percentage of the immortal population gets permission to reproduce? Do we exile excess population to space colonies or underwater cities, creating a permanent underclass of exiles born into a world that has no room for them? Or do we simply let population growth continue until resource scarcity triggers wars and famines that dwarf anything in human history? A Malthusian catastrophe played out on a planetary scale? The political landscape would ossify in ways that make our current political divisions look quaint. Imagine a world where the people who hold power never age, never die, never give up their positions. Presidents and prime ministers serving thousand-year terms. Supreme Court justices who were appointed in the 21st century still making decisions in the 35th century. Dictators who consolidate power and then rule for millennia, their regimes never ending, because the dictator never ends. Political change in our current world comes partly through the death of old leaders and the emergence of new ones with different ideas shaped by different circumstances. But in an immortal world, leaders who came to power during, say, the early 22nd century would still be making policy decisions in the year 3000, their worldview frozen in the assumptions and prejudices of their original era, unable or unwilling to adapt to a world that has changed beyond recognition while they remain the same. Democracy itself might not survive this transition. How do you maintain the principle that every generation should have a voice in shaping their future when generations stop ending? When the same individuals vote in every election for centuries? When popular opinion can't shift because people with outdated ideas simply refuse to die and make room for new perspectives? Science and technology might actually accelerate in some ways, because the same brilliant minds that make breakthroughs early in their careers wouldn't lose their sharpness with age. Einstein could still be doing physics. Marie Curie could still be advancing our understanding of radioactivity. Every genius in history could continue contributing indefinitely, building on their own previous work in ways impossible when scientific careers are limited to a few productive decades. But there's a darker possibility, which is that science would stagnate because new ideas require new people, fresh perspectives unburdened by the assumptions of previous generations. Max Planck once said that science advances one funeral at a time, meaning that old scientists rarely abandon their cherished theories. So real progress happens when they die, and younger scientists with different ideas take over. In an immortal world, those old scientists never die, never relinquish their positions, never stop defending their outdated theories. Graduate students would wait centuries for positions that never open up. Young researchers with revolutionary ideas would be dismissed by immortal gatekeepers who've been reviewing grant applications for 300 years and think they've seen it all before. Culture would fragment and diversify in ways that might literally make different groups unable to understand each other. Language evolves over time, but that evolution is usually gradual enough that each generation can communicate with the next. When people live forever, you'd have individuals whose native language is early 21st century English, trying to communicate with people whose native language is whatever English has evolved into by the year 2500. They might be mutually unintelligible, speaking what are technically the same language but separated by centuries of evolution. Fashion, music, art, all the cultural markers that define generations would lose meaning when the same individuals persist across centuries. Would immortal humans even develop new cultural trends? Or would culture ossify just like politics and economics, with the same styles and preferences persisting for centuries because the people who hold those preferences never die? Youth culture, as we know it, would vanish, because youth itself would stop being a life stage you move through and become instead a brief period before you settle into whatever version of yourself you want to be for the next several centuries. The psychology of immortality would create mental health crises we can barely imagine. Human brains evolved to handle maybe 80 years of memories, experiences, and personal growth. What happens when you try to pack 500 years of experiences into a brain that wasn't designed for that much information? Do memories start fading? Not from disease, but from simple capacity limitations, until you can't remember your childhood, or your first loves, or the early decades of your life? Do you become a different person every few centuries? The accumulated weight of experiences literally changing who you are until the you of year 400 has nothing in common with the you of year 0. The concept of personal identity becomes philosophically fraught when the same body persists for centuries, but the mind inside it has changed beyond recognition. Are you still you if you don't remember the first 200 years of your life? If your values and personality have shifted so dramatically that your younger self would barely recognize you? Boredom would become an existential threat. Human psychology is built around novelty, around the excitement of new experiences and the anticipation of unknown futures. But after a few centuries, you've done everything. You've traveled to every country, tried every career, mastered every skill you're capable of mastering, read every book, watched every movie, had every conversation worth having. The world becomes predictable. Patterns repeat. Nothing surprises you anymore. Some immortals might develop coping mechanisms, deliberately erasing their own memories to recreate the feeling of novelty, experiencing things for the first time over and over. Others might retreat into virtual realities where they can experience simulated novelty that feels fresh even when it's algorithmically generated. The most desperate might simply choose to end their lives voluntarily, deciding that they've experienced enough and continuing to exist serves no purpose. Suicide rates among immortals could be staggeringly high, not because life is bad, but because it's too long, because consciousness itself becomes a burden when extended indefinitely. Religion and philosophy would undergo transformations more radical than anything since the Enlightenment. Most religions offer the promise of an afterlife as compensation for the difficulties of mortal existence. But if this life never ends, what becomes of those promises? Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, all the major world religions are built on the assumption that earthly existence is temporary, a test or a journey towards something else. Remove mortality, and the entire theological framework collapses. Would religions adapt, developing new interpretations that accommodate immortality? Would they die out entirely, becoming historical curiosities as people stop needing the comfort they provide? Or would they intensify, with fundamentalists arguing that biological immortality is an affront to the divine plan, that humans have overreached by conquering death and will face supernatural punishment for their hubris? New religions might emerge specifically designed for immortal beings, offering meaning structures based on endless existence rather than preparing for death. The question of reproduction would become the most contentious political and ethical issue in immortal civilization. If people can't die and they keep having children, the population problem becomes unsolvable within a few generations. But forcing people not to have children strikes at one of the most fundamental human drives, the biological imperative that's guided evolution for billions of years. Would we create a society where only a tiny elite gets to reproduce while everyone else is sterilized? Would we implement a lottery system where aspiring parents enter a drawing and only winners get to conceive? Would we require people to volunteer for euthanasia if they want to have children? A life for a life exchange where every birth must be balanced by a death? Each option is morally horrifying in different ways, and yet some choice must be made because the alternative is population growth until ecosystem collapse and mass starvation, which is arguably even more horrifying. Young people in this world would face a particularly cruel situation, immortal but forbidden to create new life. Watching older generations enjoy both biological immortality and the children they had before the restrictions were implemented, while being denied that same opportunity themselves. The class divisions would become literally permanent. In our current world, wealth inequality is bad, but at least theoretically changeable. Poor people can become rich. Rich people can lose their fortunes. Every generation starts the game somewhat fresh. But in an immortal world, the same individuals accumulate wealth century after century, compounding returns over timescales that make our current billionaires look like temporary success stories. Someone who started investing in the stock market in 2100 would have, by the year 2500, accumulated wealth beyond comprehension simply through compound interest, even with modest returns. The wealth gap between immortal old money and immortal young people who started with nothing would be unbridgeable. Social mobility would cease to exist as a concept. You would be born into whatever class your family occupies, and that's where you'd stay forever, because the people above you never die, never retire, never vacate their positions to create space for upward movement. The immortal poor would face an eternity of poverty, while immortal elites enjoy endless luxury, and both groups would be locked in their positions permanently. Technology would evolve in strange directions, driven by the unique needs of immortal beings. Entertainment would become humanity's biggest industry, as people seek increasingly elaborate ways to stave off boredom. Virtual reality would advance to the point where you can live entire lifetimes in simulated worlds, experiencing adventures and challenges that feel completely real, even though they're digital constructs. Some immortals might spend centuries in these simulations, rarely emerging into physical reality. Memory management technology would become crucial. Devices that let you selectively forget experiences so you can re-experience them fresh, or compress old memories to free up mental space for new ones. Body modification would explode as immortals seek novelty through physical transformation, changing their appearance, their gender, even their species through advanced genetic engineering, becoming something new every few decades just to maintain some sense of change and growth. Transportation would shift toward very long-term journeys, with immortals willing to spend 50 years traveling to distant star systems because 50 years is nothing when you have unlimited time. The entire economy would reorient around serving the needs of beings who can't die, but desperately need reasons to continue living. Space exploration would finally become practical in ways it never could be for mortal humans. The journey to Mars takes months, to the outer planets years, to even the nearest star decades. For mortal humans, these timeframes make exploration almost impossible because you're spending a huge percentage of your limited lifespan in transit. But for immortals, spending 20 years traveling to Alpha Centauri is trivial, a brief adventure. Humanity could spread across the galaxy not through faster-than-light travel, which might be physically impossible, but through sheer patience, immortals taking century-long journeys to distant star systems and establishing colonies that themselves last for millennia. The galaxy would become our playground over timescales that would have meant nothing to mortal humans, but are perfectly acceptable when you're not racing against the clock of aging and death. We might encounter alien civilizations and discover that they're also immortal, that any species advanced enough to achieve interstellar travel necessarily conquers aging first because mortality makes long-distance space exploration impractical. The environment would face unprecedented pressure from immortal humanity's endless consumption. Currently, environmental damage is limited partly by the fact that humans die before they can consume too many resources, but immortals consume indefinitely, requiring food, water, energy, and raw materials century after century. Earth's ecosystems would collapse within a few hundred years under the weight of billions of immortals all needing resources continuously. We would be forced to expand beyond Earth, not out of curiosity or ambition, but out of desperate necessity, hollowing out asteroids for raw materials, building habitats in space, terraforming other planets to create new living space. The immortal humans of the year 3000 might look back at Earth as a historical curiosity, the small planet where humanity originated before we spread across the solar system, and eventually the galaxy, driven by population pressure that could never be relieved because nobody ever dies. And yet, despite all these challenges, there's something undeniably appealing about the prospect of immortality. Imagine having unlimited time to pursue every interest, master every skill, explore every corner of human knowledge and experience. You could spend a century becoming a world-class pianist, then another century studying marine biology, then switch to architecture, to literature, to whatever catches your interest, building a life so rich and varied that it dwarfs anything possible in a mortal lifespan. You could watch human civilization evolve over millennia, seeing patterns that are invisible to people who only live 80 years, understanding history in a way that's literally impossible for mortal minds. You could form friendships that last centuries, relationships so deep and well developed that they make current human relationships seem shallow by comparison. You could explore the universe knowing that no journey is too long, no destination too distant, because you have all the time in existence. But as we've seen throughout this thought experiment, immortality is a monkey's paw wish, something that sounds perfect until you actually think through the implications. We imagine living forever as an extended version of being young and healthy, but the reality would be stranger and darker than that fantasy. The population problems alone might make biological immortality impossible unless combined with reproductive restrictions so severe that they'd make life barely worth living. The psychological burden of unlimited existence might drive suicide rates so high that immortality becomes just a longer prelude to voluntary death. The social ossification might create civilizations so rigid and unchanging that they make medieval feudalism look dynamic and progressive. Remove death, and you remove one of the fundamental forces that shapes human behavior, human culture, human meaning. Death is the deadline that gives urgency to our choices. It's the scarcity that makes time valuable. It's the shared fate that creates human solidarity. The knowledge that we're all in this together, all facing the same inevitable end. So we return to that morning in the year 2150, you standing in front of the mirror, looking at an unchanged face, contemplating the centuries stretching ahead of you. The sunlight streaming through your window is the same sunlight that illuminated Earth billions of years before humans existed and will continue billions of years after we're gone. Indifferent to whether individual humans live 80 years or 800. You think about your mortal ancestors, people who lived their brief lives knowing they would end, and you wonder if maybe they had something you've lost. Some intensity of experience that comes from understanding that every moment is precious because there are so few of them. The immortals you know seem curiously hollow, going through the motions of existence without the passion that drove the limited lives of their mortal ancestors. You realize that immortality hasn't made humans into gods. It's made them into something sadder, creatures who exist without truly living, who have all the time in the world but no urgency to use it, who persist indefinitely without ever arriving anywhere in particular. And in that realization, you understand something profound. We were never meant to live forever. The beauty of human existence isn't despite our mortality, but because of it. The knowledge that our time is limited, giving weight and meaning to every choice, every relationship, every moment we experience. Death isn't the enemy we've always imagined. It's the boundary that makes life precious, the ending that gives structure to the story, the final note that resolves the melody into something complete and whole and beautiful. Remove it, and you don't create paradise. You create something stranger and lonelier than mortality ever was. An existence that lasts forever but means nothing at all.